I'm Luke Cannon, and thanks for having me this evening. It's a joy to be here, and it's a joy to do this work. I have a little organization locally here in Asheville called Astounding Earth, and mostly I am teaching ecology and naturalist skills. So I do classes and workshops on birds and mushrooms and lichens and mosses and trees and wildflowers, etc. And kind of my favorite thing is taking folks out in the woods and helping people to build their relationships with the natural world. Um, let's see. Um, I'm an expert. I'm a PhD. I'm not certified. I'm not a PhD. I have no qualifications, other than I've been spending a lot of time in the woods since I was about 14 years old. And I have been fortunate to have a lot of mentors and have a lot of folks who've kind of like initiated me in some way or another into diving deep into relationships with the natural world. I've certainly put in a lot of book hours as well, and hopefully I believe everything that I'll try to share with you this evening is from my personal experience and my time with wild foods. So just know that piece. I'm not just reading things out of books or online from some wild foods blog and telling you what I think is probably pretty good information. Um, also, I'll just say a big important piece of my background is that I went through a public school in Washington D.C. and in my particular education course, it happened to be that by the time I got to the end of 11th grade, which was the time I dropped out of high school, I had not yet been taught any trees in my area, any birds in my area, any plants in my area. Um, maybe, no, I don't think any mammals either. So I had very little education, both about the natural world, definitely about the ecology, and very little space was open to me for learning about the life on this planet, for having a chance to admire it or appreciate it or build relationship with it. And so that's just a huge part of my story that from then on, I felt like I became determined to find ways that we could increase our eco-literacy, that we could build our relationships deeper with our amazing planet, and just try to have it more in our common culture, to be like checking out our world, learning the life that's here, getting to know it in personal ways, and bringing it into our life. And that's still something I really advocate for. I have students who are Apple Watch game designers, who are dance choreographers, who do all sorts of sales and marketing, and I always tell them, like, yeah, whatever it is you do, perfect. Like, let's build relationship with the natural world, go deeper with it, and bring it into whatever you're doing. Because certainly we're at a time on the planet where it's greatly needed. So whatever the thing you do is, carpentry, demolition, whatever it is, there's a place for our relationships with the other life in our ecosystems, in our communities around Asheville, North Carolina, for that to be in your life. That would be my belief. So that's a little bit of where I'm coming from. Oh, and I've got one of these here. Da-da-da-da-da. Hey, it's working. Wonderful Wild Foods of the Southern Appalachians is this presentation. And yeah, it's a bunch of fun. I've got a little picture here of an ecosystem. This is up right off the Blue Ridge Parkway, just north of town, and underneath these beautiful tulip poplars, there's a bunch of purple flowers. They seem a little bit fuzzy, so I won't expect you to know the genus or species offhand, but these are in the waterleaf family. This is a fern-leafed phacelia, and it's just one of many, many examples of a whole carpet of beautiful and, in this case, edible wild plants that are just abundant here in the Southern Appalachians. And we'll talk more about different ecosystems as we go along today. I'll mention the photos in this presentation. Most of them, more than half of them, are taken by me. Also, my dear friend Natalie Bogwalker, who works for Wild Abundance up in Barnardsville, she did some of the photos for this. We do a wild foods hike every spring together. where we take a whole big group of people on the Appalachian Trail for a few days, and we examine wild foods, and we taste them, and we prepare them, and we camp out, and it's a whole bunch of fun. We just did that a few weeks ago, actually, and it was a great group. And then actually my former partner and friend, Victoria Greba, she has a company down in Florida at this point, but she also has taken a number of the photographs that are in here too from her plant walks. And yeah, and this little plant on the bottom left, we'll talk about it more later, but that is our local woodland nettle. Anyone know that the local stinging nettle? Anybody run through that with shorts on? Oh, yeah, arthritis no longer. So a little arc of what I'm hoping to cover in the next 1 hour and 42 minutes is big picture considerations. If you're getting into wild foods, or maybe you've been into them for a while, what are some of the things you want to consider around ethics and legalities, and how you're affecting the plants, or how the plants are affecting you? So I want to get into some big picture considerations, and then jump right into delicious plants that you can be eating that will probably actually benefit and help our native ecosystems, as opposed to hurt them in any way. And then we're going to get into eating trees. Have you all watched beavers for a little bit? No, I'm just going to go over a number of edible species that are trees, that are producing leaves or fruits or nuts, etc., that you'll be able to go back to again and again and again. By the way, my usual classrooms are all outside. Teaching inside is completely not my typical environment, and often when I touch these things, they explode or smoke or make noises or something. So we'll see what happens. Might be exciting. Yes, thank you for being here. So eating trees, fantastic fungi. I've got a number of my favorite fungal species that I included in the slideshow. Luscious greens. This is the time of year where greens are so abundant. Don't even think about going to the grocery store to buy kale. Maybe the farmer's market to support your local farmers, but there are so many wild greens out right now. You could just fill baskets and baskets and bring them home. Tasty blossoms. There are so many delicious blossoms that are still out right now, and how we can add those into our diet and make our food even more beautiful and nectiferous. Bountiful berries will be our last little category, and then some closing thoughts. Does that sound okay? Kind of what you were coming here for, hopefully? Awesome. So why wild foods? Why are we getting into wild foods? I mean, it's so tough to harvest, and there's so much to learn about, and they're so expensive. And why wild foods? So for me, there's a lot of reasons to get into wild foods. Again, I want to say that like a big mission in my life is to try to bring us to a place where our culture has a healthier relationship with the natural world, where we get to know many of the different creatures and beings that are out there, and we know them not just by their scientific name, but we have some sort of relationship with them, something that makes us actually not just know them, but like totally love them. And what I have found over my years is that one of the best ways to get people to know something deeply is by giving them the ability to engage it with as many senses as possible. And I'll tell you what, when people eat something and it's delicious, especially if they haven't eaten for a little while, which doesn't happen a lot in our culture, but when you're hungry and you eat something from the wilds and it gives you energy, it changes. It changes in your body, and it changes in your relationship. Also, sometimes just even smelling something or tasting something. How many folks have ever tasted the tree sassafras with the little mittens on the leaves? Yeah, and can you kind of maybe remember a little bit of what it smells like or tastes like? Anybody? Yeah, the root would taste so much like root beer. And how about the leaves? Anybody remember what the leaves smell like? Anything you could compare that to? Yeah, very lemony. Some people smell it and immediately, depends on what generation they are, say Fruit Loops or like Fruity Pebbles or like something like that. Absolutely. And a lot of times those plants that we can taste or smell or have this like sensory relationship with are the ones that we'll remember the most. And so one of my little submissions with wild foods is just to get people so excited about these wild foods that they're going to learn them, they're going to want to protect them, they're going to want to know about them and where they grow and what affects them in different ways. yeah, I find wild food to be a really powerful relationship builder. Um, by the way, one of the other most powerful relationship builders I found is birds. And as people begin to learn birds and learn the different bird songs and how to identify different birds that are just in their yard, it's usually life-changing for folks. And so I've been really diving deep into birds recently and enjoying that. Just a little, put that behind your ear, if you will. Don't eat the birds, even though they're wild foods, potentially. That's a whole other conversation. So just the joy of slowing down, the joy of harvesting. By the way, this greenery that everybody in this picture is laying in here, that is all a little teeny plant. It happens to be a non-native plant, but it's a fantastic edible. That's all chickweed. Have you all heard of chickweed before? Stellaria media is a European plant. And this was actually seeded. My friend's garden is just up above here, and this is kind of a steepish hill. You could roll down it. It's that steep. And they have a compost bin right up here. And so when it rains, the nutrients from the garden and what was left over from the compost just come down this hill. And so they just seeded it with chickweed seeds, and this lush patch of chickweed has grown. And there is so much. That picture is only like a third of it. There's just gobs and gobs of chickweed all spring and all fall. On the left is just a little picture showing closer observation. Again, some of the practices of wild foods get us to look closely at the details. We might need a field guide for some of it, but we're going to hopefully slow down and just be in the moment. And the joy of going out to harvest your food in and of itself, it's like while you're out there harvesting is when the indigo bunting lands near you and sings, and you look up and happen to notice the sun is hitting it at just the angle that makes the blue look like a bright neon sign, and you're just in there, and it might be the best moment in your day, and that maybe came because you went outside to harvest a little food from your garden. What was your yard and is now your garden. Those are some reasons for wild foods. Anybody else want to add another one on top? I'm sure that there are many.
It's fresher than anything you can buy at the grocery store. It's completely fruity. It's nutritious. And it's right there.
Anywhere from minutes to moments old, right? So some of these wild foods, you can even put your hands behind your back and just right from the tree or the bush or even from the ground if you're a yogini. And absolutely. Not to mention that the nutrient spectrums and the trace minerals that are in a lot of our wild foods, from the forest particularly, are going to be amazingly diverse, even more so than in high-grade organic agriculture. And I was an organic farmer for 7 years, and I highly support organic agriculture. It's amazing. And like our forests, especially the intact ecosystems, are just chock full of amazing nutrients and nutritional components that it would be hard for us to replicate in most of our production scale agriculture. Ethics, legalities, and considerations. There's a lot to say here. And it feels important for me to put this up front. I feel like wild foods are becoming more and more popular, and which I think is great. And as our ginormous population is looking at going out into the wilds to harvest, to the wilds, all sorts of different places, I think we need to just be really wise about how we go about our harvests. I should probably know the range and abundance first, but I'm going to hold that for just a second. Legalities and regulations. Yeah, things to know. One, if it's on private land, ask for permission, right? If you don't ask for permission on someone else's private land, be sneaky, right? Be really sneaky. But generally, if it's on private land, definitely ask for permission. Good neighborly relationships, I think, is really important. National forest, national parks, state forest, and state parks. This is a whole can of worms, and I'll try to simplify it and say this. Parks, no. State park or national park, usually there's no harvesting allowed at all. Sometimes they'll let you pick berries. Sometimes you can ask permission for mushrooms, and depends on what ranger is present that day. They may say yay or nay. But even when you're picking berries or mushrooms, they will tell you only for personal consumption on the spot, right? You can't take anything away or home with you. So parks are generally no harvest zones, or just eat on the spot zones. Very, very different than national forest or state forest. The purposes of our national forest and state forests are to be resources for people. And for a long time, it's just been like, harvest whatever you want, go for it. Often, for certain things you harvest, there's a fee involved in an application process. One important thing to know is that different forest districts, national forest districts, actually have different regulations on how much of what you can harvest. So if I told you what the deal is for Pisgah, it might be different for Nantahala, it might be different for Cherokee National Forest. So you'll want to call your local forest district ranger station and ask them what the regulations are for a particular plant you're harvesting. That said, I have called all three districts and asked a whole bunch of questions about what to harvest and not harvest. And the only things I can find regulations on are ramps, ginseng, and galax. And galax. Galax is harvested in mass quantity for floral arrangements, so not edible. Not edible. Here's what happens. I call up Pisgah Ranger Station. I usually talk to either Mary or what's the other woman's name? I don't remember the other one right now. And I say, hey Mary, it's Luke calling again. I'm interested in going out with my family and harvesting sassafras leaves and basswood leaves, and we'd like to harvest some milkweed shoots. Can you tell me the regulations? Do I need to fill out a one-day harvesting permit? Because often that's the case. Even if it's free, you usually have to fill out a 24-hour harvesting permit. And she says, I don't know about those things. Let me check the list, and I'll call you back later today. And I say, great, thanks, Mary. And Mary called me back later in the day. She's so friendly. And it's just like, hey, Luke, great. The thing to know is that you don't need to actually fill out an application for any of those items. You can harvest up to 1 gallon per person for family use only, as long as you're not reselling any of it. And that's all you need to know, and that should be fine. So far, I have not found a food item that I've wanted to harvest that she has given me any other answer for. So that's the information I've been getting from Mary at the Pisgah Ranger Station. And I have done that in Nantahala, and I have done that in Cherokee too. So most of the time, folks just don't know. They're just like, I don't know. They look at their list of things that people harvest, and they're like, what you're asking about isn't on here. You know, like, what are you harvesting it for? And I'm just like, oh, it's edible. It's a good edible. And they're just like, okay, cool. So national forest regulations, it seems like call and ask permission isn't a bad idea. 1 gallon per person for home use only, per day, by the way. So that's the information I've gotten so far.
And the three things, galax for flowers, but ramps, and what was the other thing?
Ginseng.
Ginseng, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. State forest, I've never been able to get anyone to call me back. But my hunch would be, yeah, better to err on the side of prudent.
They do have a similar sort of process as the National Forest in terms of some things having requiring permits. Like there's a permitting process, so it is good to call and ask.
Great. And my experience with state forests is that some are highly managed and regulated, like DuPont State Forest, which gets so much recreational use, and others are kind of like backwoods places where most people just hunt there during deer season or turkey season, and like you'd never ever see a ranger there, and it would be hard to get anyone to tell you anything about it. So it depends, I think, a lot on which state forest you're talking about and who's running it, who's managing it. Game lands, that's another conversation.
Does anybody check on what you've actually done?
No. No. I think there's like 2 rangers who monitor that for the whole district. And almost all of my harvesting is pretty far off trail. So, which I'll just mention too. There's a lot to say here. As much as possible, I don't harvest anything from right next to a trail. I don't think that that is necessarily a bad thing, and I'm trying to be aware that some of the trails, even some of the ones that I use that are pretty far from the main, from really popular recreational areas, it still might be someone's like only like mountain bike ride or dog walking experience of the week. And so as much as possible, even if there's a big beautiful mushroom or a nice cluster of berries, I generally don't harvest from next to trails just to leave it there for aesthetic beauty. I don't know that that's ethical. It's just a little personal choice, but it's something that I would recommend for others. So the next piece is knowing range, abundance, the range and the abundance of the plant that you're harvesting. And I think this is a really important piece. And I can't tell you how many wild foods programs I've gone to and kind of watched over and listened to that don't mention anything about knowing a plant's range or abundance. And I just want to like highly promote the idea that you should not pick any plant that you don't know its range or abundance. None. Don't pick a plant, right? So you don't have to memorize it, but at least at some point look it up and figure out, is that plant only in North Carolina? Does that plant go up and down the East Coast? Does it go up and down the East Coast, but it only grows on the left side of waterfalls that face southeast, right? What's the range of your plant? How much land does it cover, and how abundant or not abundant is it? That kind of information is more available to us than it has ever been. One of the many places you could go find that is the Biota of North America program. You can just Google Biota of North America program, and then there is under that, there's the Flora of the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic States. I'm sorry, those are two separate things. Biota of North America program, if you go to that website, you can look up plants. Typically, you look them up by genus and species. And then you can get a range map for that plant and all of the counties it's found in North America, no, in the United States and parts of Canada, but particularly in the United States. So then you can see, awesome, this is a non-native plant, in which case it would be colored in purple, or it is what states it's found in will be shown in dark green, what counties it's found in are shown in light green, where it is rare is shown in yellow. And so you've got these little maps that right away tell you, awesome, this thing is all over the East Coast. That's fantastic. Oh, this thing is only in a few counties in our area. I want to consider that and maybe not harvest it or go really light in my harvesting. And I will show you a map. Actually, I think I even have a map of this plant here as an example of that. This plant on the right-hand side is related to ginseng. It's called spikenard, Aurelia racemosa. And it's like a ginormous ginseng, and instead of just making like 3 or 4 berries, it makes hundreds of berries, and the berries are really delicious and zingy and zangy and fun to put into jams and ferments and just eat even raw off the plant. Yeah, and we'll talk about spikenard a little bit more in another slide. The Flora of Southeast and Mid-Atlantic States by Alan Weekly. There's a PDF online, or you can actually buy a hard copy of the book. But either way, you get range maps for all of southeastern and mid-Atlantic United States. And those range maps actually show you within its range where the plant is abundant, where it is, where it's common, where it's uncommon, and where it's rare, as well as if it's a native or non-native. So that's another resource. Most field guides will also give you a basic range of any plant. So ideally, you've identified the plant well already if you're thinking about putting it in your body. And so once you've got a plant, you know its name, you can look it up, find out its genus and species, and plug it into here, or at least get the general range in a field guide that you're using. So does that make sense? There's just so many of us, and if so many people are going out to eat plants, we want to really be aware of what our impact is. And all of it might change in 20 years, right? The ranges of some plants that are super abundant might become much, much less abundant depending on who's eating them and what eating choices we make. And we'll get into that too. Stewarding a patch. So this is a little thing that I do in my practice, and I really recommend for y'all, is that I often find patches of particular plants that I really like, and ideally in places where not a lot of other people know about them, but whatever's good. And I will designate a particular patch of plants as like my patch, even if it's a national forest or something. And it's not that I'm going to try to protect it from other people. It's that I'm going to be like, okay, this is the little area of wild cucumber that I'm going to harvest from. Or ramps could be another great example. And if I start to see this patch shrinking in size, I'm not going to go and harvest from somewhere else. I'm going to work with this patch to get its population into a sustainable, into a sustainable size. I'm going to be collecting seeds and replanting seeds. If my patch shrinks too much where it's no longer collectible, then obviously something is not going right there. Either someone else is over-harvesting, or I'm over-harvesting, or I'm having an impact that isn't helpful to the plant. But so far, in pretty much all of my experiences, when I stored a patch, I'm able to keep it going and figure out what the patch needs in order to thrive and survive. So that's a nice little thing that I think we could be doing more of. Collect and distribute seeds. I think one of the most amazing things that we have the ability to do as humans is to grab seeds and take seeds other places. It can also be one of the most detrimental things we can do to the ecosystem and habitat. So we want to be careful about this and know about if the plant is a native, a non-native, or if in fact it's more than non-native, if it happens to be an invasive species, which is defined in different ways by different people, but I would define it as a species that once introduced to a native ecosystem disrupts the native ecosystem. There's a lot of questions about time, like, well, how long does it have to be there before it's disrupting a native ecosystem? And there's a lot of questions there, but just to say, seeds are awesome if we're dealing with plants that are from native ecosystems of our area. To be able to gather those seeds and help disperse them can be a wonderful thing. So tending the ecosystem, practicing reciprocity we're about to get into, and then just beginning on your own piece of land. Wherever you live, there's probably some awesome plants right in your yard, whether they're native or non-native, and so start there and work out from there. Okay, Biota North America program, Aurelia nudicalis. That's actually a different species than the one I just showed you a minute ago, which was Aurelia racemosa. But Aurelia nudicalis is another relative of ginseng. And I do have some patches in our area in Buncombe County. You can see that it is here in our county, and then it comes down Appalachia. Up north in Maine, it's hard to walk in the woods without trampling Aurelia nudicalis, this amazing medicinal ginseng relative. And a lot of Michigan is the same. In a lot of upstate New York, it's the same. But, I mean, it's just a really, really abundant plant. However, if you talk to someone from Maine or upstate New York or Michigan and they're telling you how abundant this plant is, you might then see the plant down here and be like, awesome, I found a patch of Aurelia nudicalis. I can go for it. I can harvest this root. It's medicinal. It's not worth as much as ginseng on the market, but it's actually a really good medicine. But look, down here, it's like, yeah, we've got some in the mountains, but look at all the surrounding area where there isn't much. And actually, the patches here in the mountains are rather few and far between. So this is just a case in point of like knowing the range of your plant and how abundant it is in your part of the country is really important. And for that reason, I don't harvest Aurelia nudicalis down here. Maybe once every other year or something like that, I'll take one root. But it's not the kind of thing that I would do in Michigan or in Maine or in Vermont, where we might go out and gather 100 roots, because there's like more than 1 million plants, in a given area of the forest. There's just like it's a ground cover. But down here, it's like, no way. I would never gather like 20 plants down here. I would probably wipe out most of the patch. And even though there are some patches down here that have 500 plants in them, I know that they're fairly rare. So learning the range map of where your plant grows, I think, is really important. Questions on that? So, by the way, the dark green, again, means just that it exists somewhere in the state. The light green means it's been confirmed to be found in a particular county. The yellow means it's found in the county and it is known to be rare, which is a little tricky because that means it's actually gone through a process to be legally called rare in that county. There's a lot of these counties where it's actually probably rare and it just hasn't gone through the process of being declared rare. And then if it were pink anywhere on here, if one of these counties was bright pink, that would let us know that it was invasive. It was a non-native in that particular county. So that's what the maps look like if you go to the Biota of North America program and you type in any plant that you're interested in looking up. Pretty cool, huh? What an awesome resource. So I mentioned reciprocity earlier. What is reciprocity? What does that mean? What goes around comes around. What's it another? If you're going to take, give back. Yeah, awesome. No wrong answers here. It's just like a question that I think is really important for us to check out. What is reciprocity? In my mind, it's actually impossible to take without giving back. It's impossible. Although short term, we might not be giving back, but at some point, we're going to be forcing others to give back. There's probably some way that we'll be giving back immediately. But the practice of take without bringing things back to balance, without reciprocity, is going to probably bring us to a state of off balance, often known as dis-ease, whether it's in the body or in the ecosystem. And yeah, I put this bird up there. What bird is that, anybody? The pileated woodpecker, absolutely. And I put the pileated woodpecker up there because it is a keystone species. And I wanted to just like use it as an example. The pileated woodpecker, I'll go back for just a second, is a species that so many other hundreds of species rely on because of the way it chooses to live its life. So the pileated woodpecker is our only woodpecker these days that is strong enough and has strong enough muscles and beak to break through really hard hardwoods and get in to eat out beetle grubs and to make hollow cavities in trees. Usually they kind of look like rectangles. And once they do that, some fungus will go in and start rotting out the wood, and then carpenter ants go in, or carpenter bees go in, and all sorts of other insects go in and start eating more of that wood. And then other birds like chickadees and titmice and prothonotary warblers, they can go in and take out some more of the wood that's soft now inside because the fungi have decomposed it a bit, and build their cavities inside. It makes space for so many insects, for both the southern flying squirrel and the Carolina flying squirrel, one of our threatened species in North Carolina. Many, many, many other species are reliant on the pileated woodpecker because of its ability to make those holes into tougher woods, into hardwoods. So it ends up being what we call a keystone species. And I think that that is something that we want to strive towards. Can we live in a way that we have incredible benefit to many other species? And my question for you is like, what would that be like for you? You know, what practices are you already doing in your life that benefit many other species? What practices are you doing in your life that maybe aren't beneficial to other species that you could reduce? But what practices in your life could you increase that would be really beneficial to other species? There's a lot of different ways. So one of the simple definitions that I like for reciprocity is the practice of mutual benefit. How can you live in a way that is beneficial for both you and other beings at the same time? One of the things that I like to remind folks when we talk about wild foods is, in my mind, it's not a free-for-all. I've heard some of the wild food folks over different parts of the country be just like, wild foods are amazing. There's all this food and it's just free for the taking. You can just go into the forest and just harvest as much as you want and it's all free. And I'm like, oh, no, actually. You know, in my experience, it's not free, right? Our wild ecosystems are in amazing disrepair right now. And a lot of our wild ecosystems are really struggling. And a lot of that's been because of the attitude of humans going in and being like some humans going in with an attitude of, hey, we can just take whatever we want for ourselves. And so I want to just really promote tending the wild, tending good relationships, pursuing harvesting practices that might actually benefit the native ecosystems that are here as opposed to taking away from them. And that might take a little time. Probably a bunch of you are already biology or ecology buffs. If not, there's a lot of great books right now that can introduce us to ecological systems in our area, to different plant communities that are here and forest communities. And there's even some classes you can take locally, like at Astounding Earth. Oh my goodness. Where you get to go out into different ecosystems and learn about them and learn about the plants in them. Shameless, absolutely shameless. Yeah, so in my life, I just think committing ourselves to being stewards and advocates for the native ecosystems, and there's all kinds of things we can do. I've got a picture of someone filling their bird feeder, which the birds don't need us to do, but it sure is nice to build a little relationship. It's mostly for us, but some of the birds really probably benefit, especially with the cold snaps and making it through some of these hard moments when we give them a little bit of sunflower seeds. here, there's a picture of someone down here picking some leaves at the bottom left. Anybody recognize those leaves that are being harvested? They're medicinal. It looks in this picture a lot like wild ginger, except that they're toothy, but they are heart-shaped just like wild ginger. It is garlic mustard, absolutely. And so it's just an example of both a food and a medicine that we can harvest and actually be benefiting our ecosystem. And by the way, when I harvest garlic mustard, I'm always pulling it out by the roots. And then I'm taking it home as carefully as possible, especially if it's going to seed, which it often is. Most of its life it's going to seed. It's a fast bloomer. And trying to be careful not to spill those seeds anywhere. And I'm taking them home and then trimming off the seeds. Particularly, I'm generally pulling off the leaves, a lot of which I'll dehydrate and use in green powders to get a really nice, strong, garlicky powder. I'll do that with, mix it with salt to make a garlic mustard salt. But it's the stems I'm going for, and I think I talk about that in an upcoming slide, but I'll just spoil it now and just say this is the young stems of garlic mustard. It's the good stuff, right? The leaves, how many folks have eaten the leaves before? You know, it's like there's a taste. You gotta like bitter and garlic together, and it's more like powdered garlic than it is like fresh garlic. It's kind of like not a good meal before a first date, or probably a second date or a third date. Yeah, the leaves are kind of intense. The stems, however, the young stems are a lot like asparagus, with just a hint of garlic to them. They're absolutely delicious. It's why the plant is sometimes cultivated in parts of southeastern Asia. It's for the stems, not for the leaves. And those stems are absolutely delicious. You'll know if they're good because you can just kind of feel your way down the stem and what's tender and what can you just snap off with your fingers. If you can't snap it off, if instead it's like tough, then it's probably too old, or you just need to go a little higher up on the stem.
So why are we not spreading the seeds on that?
We're not spreading the seeds on this one because this plant happens to be pretty invasive. It comes into native ecosystems. It can spread into the forest, not just, it doesn't just stay on the edges in the disturbed areas. And it actually has some chemicals that it releases that prevents seeds from other plants from sprouting. It has allelopathic chemicals.
No, I was just saying interesting.
Yeah. I haven't seen it take over huge forest areas in our area as much as I have seen it from Virginia up to Maine. It seems like it prefers it a little bit cooler and more north, but I see it in places here starting to go for it, especially along the French Broad, and there's a number of forested spots. So I don't know if it's just like waiting to like make its move on southern Appalachia. I think it's probably read all of the recent real estate magazines. It's like Asheville's the place to be now. So it's starting to show up, and it's just luckily it's easy to pull and it's tasty. Awesome, right? Let's work it. Let's go for it. Yeah. So there's tending the wild down there with knowing that we can harvest some of these invasive plants. And then I put this up just to say, like, let's live as simply as we can. That's going to be different for different folks, and a lot of people have different needs. But let's experiment with how simply we can live, with how little of an impact we can have on the planet, and just see what that feels like. And that might mean really different things to different people. But I'm just going to tell you, whatever it is that you already know in your mind that you could do that would make a little bit less of an impact, just go for it. Just go for it a little bit more, and find the joys of simple living, and maybe, yeah, whatever that means to you. Of course, there's a wheelbarrow there with fresh starts in it. Those are probably native plants that they're transplanting into their yard in. Passive solar house, etc. And then this down here, I just put in this little picture of an altar to give you permission to, in whatever way feels good to you, appreciate the mystery, the sacred, if you will, or the spirit of connecting with the wild places. There's so much there that feeds our soul, and I just want to say that I think that things like song and altars and prayer, I think that those are important parts of the relationship too, and I'll let you find your own way with that. But don't ignore that with wild foods. If it feels calling to you in some way to have that as part of your reciprocity, I think it's an important thing. Even sometimes telling jokes. It seems like harvesting mushrooms, when I'm asking them what they're wanting, they love jokes. I tell a lot of jokes to mushrooms when nobody's around. Sometimes when there's other people around. Okay, let's jump into the plants. I wonder what it was I said that made those two leave. Huh? Was there that joke, or was it? Huh? So again, I'm going to go into weeds first as the first group of wild foods because all the plants I'm going to talk about right now are non-natives. They're things that we can harvest in abundance, and we're often doing good for the ecosystems by harvesting them. Yeah. So one of the plants that I want to start with here is this little one on the bottom right-hand side, which is a mallow. It's a little less common here than up in New York. I was an organic farmer for 7 years up in New York. In any of my fields that I didn't tend, or any of my garden plots I didn't tend, this plant would come in really abundantly. This is a mallow called Malva neglecta. Right? And it's called that because it tends to grow in neglected garden spaces. And I just think like, oh my goodness, praise the Lord for Malva neglecta. It is such a delicious green, and it just grows itself, and it like feeds off of the garden space that like I didn't even have time to tend this season, and yet here it is like booming with food. And anybody here eaten the mallows before? Yeah, this is one that they tend to be a little bit mucilaginous, absolutely. Not like okra or like a puntia, which is prickly pear, but like just a little bit. So I kind of find it to be nice. The flowers, these little pink blossoms, are absolutely edible, but if you let the flowers go, they'll turn into seeds that are these little circular seeds. They actually call them cheeses because they look like, to somebody, like cheese wheels, little cheese wheels. And they're nutty like sunflower seeds, and they're really protein rich. So both the leaves and the flowers and the seeds are delicious edibles. And again, this plant grows itself. It happens to be pretty shallow rooted, which I really like for a weed if it's in my garden or my yardin, because then if I don't want it there, I can pull it out easily and put something else in that I want there. But in the case of Malva neglecta, just bring it on. The more the merrier. So it's a really friendly weed. If it's not in your yard, I hesitate to say introduce it, but really I only see it in disturbed areas that have decent soil and full sun. So it's not likely to start spreading down your road, on the edges of the ditch, or anything like that. It wants good soil, it wants full sun, but then a little neglect after you've prepared a nice environment for it. This one here, anybody got a name for this one? Plantain, awesome. And a lot of folks might say broadleaf plantain or common plantain. Turns out we've got a good 8 species of plantains. Some of them are non-native, some of them are native. Rogel's plantain, Plantago rogelii. If you were to peel back one of these leaves, it would be magenta, kind of pinkish magenta at the bottom of the stalk. It probably grows near you. It's a native species. Ta-da! And there's a whole bunch of non-native species of plantain as well. Thank you so much. The plantains, what parts do you eat of plantain? The leaves, awesome. What else? The seeds, awesome. What else? I figured I'd just fish. I don't know. There's not much more than the leaves and the seeds. Yeah, there's not much in the way of roots. But absolutely. And I actually really got into the seeds a lot this year and last year. In the seeds, there's many different species of plantains, but some of them have seed stalks that just go up and up and up and up. And all I'm doing is harvesting that seed stalk, or you can even just harvest it right from the plant. Just pull it up with your fingernail, and all of these seeds come off into your bowl. And then take those and throw them in your iron skillet and give them a little toast like you would sesame seeds, and you have this delicious protein-rich wild seed. Fantastic. You could make a little gamaggio with it, maybe mix it in with your garlic mustard greens a little bit instead of the seaweed. Absolutely wonderful. The other way that I eat the seeds is actually when they're immature. When the seed stalk is young, it's actually green and tender, and it turns out that that's the part of the plant that is highest in choline, or some people say choline, C-H-O-L-I-N-E, which is a substance that helps us break down and assimilate fats. So choline or choline is kind of a nature, or what is it, a diet ingredient that people are really interested in these days because how it helps us to both assimilate and break down fats in energy use. But yeah, just little green seed pods. When they're still young, they're really tender. You can eat them raw, absolutely. Or you can put them in smoothies, and I'll get to that in just a second. When I'm eating the leaves, I go for the young leaves. So I go for the leaves in the middle of the rosette that tend to be a little bit more yellow-green. When they're older, they're definitely still edible, but they're starting to get really fibrous. So there's kind of a sweet spot. So plantain, mallow, and who's this up here? Dandelion, absolutely. The flowers are delicious. I don't eat the seeds. I make wishes from them. That's really important too. The greens I eat at all stages, not just the young greens. I eat the old greens too. Once again, I'll just mention that all of these plants actually are ones that you can gather the seeds of and bring them to your yard. If you're like, oh, I love dandelion, but there aren't any where I live. Well, just go to that neighbor. Get there a few days before they're out there with the spray, and just gather those dandelion seeds as much as possible. And you may need to put them in a bag or just stuff them in your pockets. And your neighbor's going to be out the window. What are they doing? And then and just take them home and just spread them, and they grow. It's like pretty much that easy. And what a wonderful gift. So besides eating the flowers and eating the leaves at all stages, the roots of dandelions are amazing. If you've never made your own dandelion coffee, it's really easy. The dandelion roots will be bigger the softer the soil is that they're growing in. So if you are up for it, grow some of them in your garden. It's really nice. My friend Doug Elliott tells a really sweet story about getting these different varieties of dandelions and trying to grow them in his garden. And he said the only trouble he had was, for some reason in that bed, all of a sudden a lot of grasses started coming in. And he had to go in there and weed out the grasses from between his dandelions. I was just like, yes, right? Where meanwhile his neighbors over on the other one weeding out the dandelions in between the grasses. It's just a beautiful irony there. So the roots get bigger the softer the soil is. And all you have to do is dig up the root, chop it off like you would a carrot, give it a quick wash, and once you've got a few roots, put them in your oven, usually about 180 to 200 degrees, and just let them sit until they dry out. And then usually once they're dry out, I'll turn it up to 400 degrees. And then what you want to do is wait basically until they're brittle and crispy. And once they're brittle and crispy, then there's a few ways you can do it. You can just chop them up. It's easy enough. You can do mortar and pestle. You could even put them in your little coffee zinger thing and go zing, zing, zing. What are those called? Coffee grinder? And thank you so much. And that makes just a really fantastic, like sweet and nutty and bitter. For the coffee drinkers, the folks who like bitter drinks, it's really nice. It's super easy and super sweet and super nice. You can roast it as much or as little as you like. How many folks are like dark roasts in here? Light roasts, medium roast, Costa Rican blend? Okay. Last but not least in this weed slide is these down here with the little pink blossoms. These are called the smart weeds. There's about 20 species, and they pretty much all look like that. As long as you've got one, they are good to eat, except if they happen to smart. Right? Why are they called smart weeds? Because some of these, especially as you go, yeah, you know what I'm talking about, as you go further south, closer and closer to Central Florida, it's more likely that you're going to get one of these smart weeds that actually is really hot and spicy. And up in New England, I had never experienced them, and I just went around and ate them as much as possible. Down here, I started farming a little bit and gardening, and I had a big patch of smartweed that I would gather all the time. They're pretty bland tasting. They don't taste particularly sweet or savory. They're not the most exciting, but they're abundant. And I would gather a whole bunch from my garden and mix them into salads. And one time I was like, oh, here's another patch I haven't been harvesting from. Awesome. So I started gathering those. And as I was walking back up to my kitchen, I put one in my mouth, and my mouth just went on fire. And I was like, whoa, this is one of those. So there are some that are really hot and spicy. Before you gather from a patch, just taste one and see how it is. Taste a little bit maybe. And if you like hot and spicy, you could eat them. That's okay too. So yes, there's some folks who are like, oh, really? I'm writing that down. Smartweeds, again, gathering the seeds is as easy as, okay, where do I want it in my yard or my garden? Awesome. Now I got edible plants growing in my garden.
Did you eat the leaves?
Absolutely. It's the leaves. The leaves and the seeds are the only parts I eat of that plant. Yeah. The stems are a little tough and fibrous. The roots are almost nothing. Yeah. By the way, that's in the buckwheat family. Buckwheat family, okra family, sunflower family, and the plantain is in its own family, Plantaceae. Common chickweed. We saw this slide earlier of the big chickweed forest down there. What a wonderful thing. This is a non-native plant. This is the European chickweed. We have several species of native chickweeds that grow in the forest. They're darker green. They're really sweet. They're really delicious. I highly recommend them. And This one is not native. This is a European species, Stellaria media, and it grows all over the place. I even see it sometimes in fairly deep woods where there's been little disturbances and disturbed patches. They're absolutely delicious. When I harvest chickweed, I'm often harvesting in a metal bowl because as I collect the greens and I put them into the bowl, what's happening is almost as soon as they're in flower, some of them are already going to seed. And I can just hear the seeds just dropping into the metal bowl. And it's just kind of like, it's like the sound of money in my pocket. I don't know what that sounds like. But I get to hear the tinkling. They're like the size of poppy seeds and they're brown. And then when I go back to my kitchen, I just give it a shake before I put it on my chopping board to chop them up to mix in salads or pesto or whatever I'm making. And then I've got all these seeds in the bottom of the bowl. And I just get to do that special things that so many humans and birds and other smart animals do, which is grab those seeds, find the place, in this case, in my garden beds directly, and I put them in. Because chickweed is very shallow rooted. It's absolutely abundant growth in spring and in fall. And what it's going to do is act as a green mulch and keep the sunlight right off of my soil. So when I water, and then it's a hot sunny day, it's going to keep a lot of water from being evaporated off. If at any point I decide I don't want it or there's something else I want to plant, I just pull it out and the roots come out real easily and I put in my basil plant or I put in whatever it is that I'm deciding to plant. So it's really easy to tend in the garden. You just push it aside, put in whatever you want. It's easy to weed, but usually you're just weeding to harvest it and bring it into the kitchen. It's just an awesome thing. If you decide you don't want it at all, you can, and you've just had so much chickweed you don't know what to do, you can just pull it out and lay it down flat, and it ends up going back into the soil just like that. So it's a really easy to manage plant. I highly recommend gathering seeds of chickweed and spreading them. You can go steal some from your neighbor's yard if you don't have some and just sprinkle them in your yard. What a delicious green. Chickweed is one of the ones that I commonly turn into pesto, by the way. There's a lot of wild foods that go great in pesto, and chickweed is just really, it's really nice. It works really well. Questions, comments, thoughts on our common chickweed? What time do we go to, by the way? Okay, we're doing great. Okay. Lamb's quarter. Right, in my garden right now, they're almost a foot tall, but not quite. They're still young and tender. And at this age, not only are the leaves delicious, and the leaves will be delicious even when the plant is as tall as me and has been around for a few months. But right now, when they're still young and only about a foot tall or so, the stems are also tender and delicious. And I'm just going to repeat that mantra a number of times throughout this presentation because there's so many wild foods and awesome plants out there that people are used to harvesting the leaves from, but they're not so used to harvesting the stems. And there's so many things that are kind of like asparagus-like, as long as we grab them when they're young. And lamb's quarter, you probably know if you've gardened before, it can be really abundant. We actually do have some native species of lamb's quarter, but the most common one in our gardens is a non-native species. You can eat the seeds, you can eat the leaves, you can eat the stems. This one, the roots are like medium tough. They're not that hard to weed out. Have folks weeded out lamb's quarter before? It tends to pull pretty easily from the garden because it only wants to grow in mellow soil most of the time. Occasionally I'll have them spread so much that it does actually take me energy to remove it from a spot where I would like to plant other things. So just know that with lamb's quarter, it's not quite as easy to remove as the mallow or the chickweed that I just talked about. And for me, it's just welcome green in my garden. It's more nutritious than spinach. I think it's better tasting than spinach. There is a variety of lamb's quarter, by the way, also called goosefoot. That's another name a lot of times folks know it by. Chinopodium, this one is Chinopodium album. There's a few species. Sometimes they get a little magenta outline around the leaves, and it's a beautiful, like bright pink variety that is almost like could be put in ornamental displays and flower displays. I have had two different friends, both in New York and down here, gather the pink ones intentionally to try to propagate that more in the garden because they thought it was so pretty. And my friend in New York was another farmer and was putting it in their green mixes. But I have to say that in my experience so far, the ones with the magenta outline actually don't taste quite as nice as the ones that don't have it. So up to you. Aesthetics is important in food, and I just like the really yummy flavor. There's a little more, I think, bitterness maybe, or maybe it's even a little bit of acridness in the one with the magenta outline. But you just taste the ones near you and see how they taste to you. Yeah, summertime abundance, whereas chickweed and smartweed, well, no, smartweed is okay in the summer too. Chickweed and those mallows tend to be spring and fall. Lamb's quarter goes all through the hot months of the summer as well. So it's a really nice, like, middle of the year green. Yep. Purple dead nettle. This is one, how many folks have this growing somewhere in your yard, right? You might think of it as a little bit of a noxious pest. I don't plant this one in my garden beds because it is harder to remove if you don't want it, but it grows there anyway, so whatever. One way you know that the purple dead nettles, by the way, which is in the mint family. This is in the mint family, even though it doesn't smell particularly minty. It kind of smells a little, I don't know, soapy's not the right word. Anybody want to describe how it smells? It's almost like it's a texture in your nose. I don't know what that means either. It has an interesting smell to it, and it's a hairy plant, and so I don't tend to eat this one raw. You can probably see the hairs even with the somewhat blurry slide. But one way you know when purple dead nettle is ready to be harvested and is out and about is if you're watching the little honeybees in your yard, they're going to have these orange mohawks. And the anthers, the part that produces the pollen in these flowers, the pollen it produces is bright orange. And so when the bees go and they go into the flower to get a little nectar sip, they get these bright orange mohawks. And you'll just see them going around, oh, my purple dead nettle is ready for harvest. If possible, pick it before it flowers and it's a little bit more tender and tasty. But what I'm going for with this is I just take a pair of scissors and I chop off the top, which is the leafy part, and I leave the stem down below, which is a little bit fibrous. And I usually take them and just put them in any cooked dish. My most common thing I put them in is omelets. And but as long as you're cooking a dish, if you're doing a vegetable stir fry or whatever thing that you like to cook in a wok or a skillet, the hairiness basically kind of goes away, and the flavor that's left, I think, is a really nice flavor. And it's just so abundant. It's one of these plants that you very well might have just big fields or patches of it, and it's really nice to include one more plant into your culinary array. Okay, we got a couple more in the weed section. Ox-eye daisy, another member of the sunflower family. Have folks eaten ox-eye daisy before? Okay, a lot of people will put the flowers in teas, which I think is really nice. The flowers themselves are totally edible. You could pick them and eat them raw. You can put them in salads. Flowers on food is just wonderful. We have a whole chapter on that coming up. The leaves are pretty much the tasty bit on these. And what I want to tell you is that these are the leaves with these crazy fun teeth on them. Really, really beautiful designs. They're really nice mixed into a salad. People will just note this like odd shaped leaf that they might not be used to, and then all of a sudden they taste it and it has a real sweet taste. Some of the kids on the farm where I used to live called it bubblegum plant, and they would just get so excited and run around and just like pick it clean. One thing I want to tell you about ox-eye daisy is it does grow as a common roadside weed. It's in disturbed areas all over the place in the countryside. But if you grab one of those and shovel it up and just try to get as much of the root mass as possible, there'll be a big rosette of leaves and then stems coming up. And you take that into nice, loamy garden soil and you put it in well cared for soil, this plant becomes this whole other creature. It goes from like this big to like this big. You can get giant patches of ox-eye daisy that will just be full of leaves, and the leaves will be like 4 times as long, and there'll be tons of blossoms, enough that you could easily be picking them regularly and putting them in little vases on your table and around your house. It's just a beautiful plant that happens to have really good edible flowers, really good edible leaves. But again, if you transplant it into good soil, because it can grow like right on the edge of gravel roads. Have folks seen that? Like you can be driving up logging roads in the forest and you'll see ox-eye daisy growing. But put it in your garden and it becomes this whole other creature, almost like a little shop of horrors. But not really. Yeah, that's what I think I want to say about it. Don't forget the flowers are really nice and tea, kind of like chamomile-esque, like a little bit sweet and mellow and calming and relaxing. It helps your shoulders just go. This is another one that you could fritter. Were you mentioning clover? White clover? Who was talking about white clover earlier? Yeah. Laura was talking about white clovers earlier, and my favorite part of the white clovers to eat are the flower heads, which I usually put in just a little bit of batter with eggs, and you can use wheat flour or coconut flour. It makes really awesome fritters. But this is another one you can fritter as well, especially if you're trying to serve a wild food to someone that's like a little bit wild food resistant or phobic, you know, like just fry something with salt and in butter on a skillet with some bread, right? And then people just eat these like fried oxeye daisies, and they can even be like cute little cakes, and they're just, yeah, really amazing, next level. You'd probably have to pay a lot of money for that at one of these fancy one-name restaurants in Asheville, like Tree or Leaf or Table or Rhubarb. Yeah, thank you. Do it at home. Save yourself $45. Weeds of the woods. So in this case, here is a non-native species. It's actually a Dioscorea. It's a yam related to sweet potatoes. And in this plant actually is not just an invader of disturbed areas. This one actually moves into our wild ecosystems. And this one particularly loves to be along streams and creeks. And its population is really zooming up. So in my mind, the more of this we can harvest, the better. Sometimes it's called cinnamon vine or air potato, or some folks call it fairy potato. And these little rootlets that grow all over the vines are about the size of a nickel, a dime to a nickel. Sometimes you'll get them as big as a quarter. And what typically happens is they're growing up all over spice bush or alder or witch hazel or some of our plants that are growing in riparian areas. And if you're going to harvest them, you have to be really careful, because as soon as you bump just a little bit into the shrub, one of the branches, the shrub will shake a little bit, and like 100 of these will fall. And anywhere they fall, they can regrow another vine, or they'll fall into the water and they'll go downstream and find another place on the bank. So it's like a little tricky, and if you don't go, they're all going to fall anyway, right? So my thing is to try to put out a little mat or even a sheet and shake onto, I said a mat, but what I meant is a tarp. And I shake onto a tarp, and I just collect as many as I can, and after that I fold up the tarp, and then I go to the middle, and then I'll take a little time to collect all the ones that maybe missed the tarp. And what I have then is a big bowl of potatoes. It's one of the fastest, most abundant wild foods that you can harvest. I mean, it's just, you can just harvest so many buckets of this in not very much time. Unfortunately, in some cases, because it means it's really abundant in your area. But some of the creeks where I live in Barnardsville are just loaded with this. Its population is really growing, and every single rootlet that you take home and chop up or mash up into mashed fairy potatoes or fritters, or however you like to prepare potatoes, the better. You're helping the ecosystem. You're collecting fruit from the wild. I feel like it's a good situation. You could pull a few vines out from the root if you want to. That's also okay. But just harvesting the rootlets will be helpful. So
is the only part edible or the little potatoes?
That's a great question. I know folks who have been experimenting with eating with the leaves. I don't have any personal experience with it, so I'm just going to tell you I don't know myself yet. I wouldn't be surprised. Please. Margaret? In Barnardsville, I'm harvesting in July at about 2,500 feet. So in our area, I can give you estimates of what time of year for Asheville, like downtown, but just know that elevation is going to change a lot. Like I was just up at Graveyard Fields today, and there was Solomon seal was just coming out of the ground, and Trillium erectum, red trillium was just blooming, and so depending on where you're at in our area, there's some real different harvest times. Have you all hung out in Graveyard Fields? Here's just a little tip. Here's just a little treat for yourself. If you like treats, if you're up for a treat, if you've been working hard and life is just what it is, right? Head up to Graveyard Fields on a weekday. If you live in Asheville, leave by 6 in the morning. See if you can leave by 5:59, and just pack a little lunch. You can eat cereal as you're driving on the parkway. Just get yourself up there by 7 o'clock or before. It takes about an hour from Asheville, and you'll have the place to yourself. And it's so quiet, and the view is, it's already light out at 6 o'clock. It was totally light on the Blue Ridge Parkway. I was looking down, actually, a friend of mine was like, what lake is that? We were looking down at pink beds, and the clouds below us in the Pink Bed Valley were so thick that he thought it was a lake. And I was like, ooh, it is the lake of the clouds. But we got up to Graveyard Fields, and then, like, hiked down You can look up chestnut-sided warbler before you go, so you know all the sounds that you're hearing. So many chestnut-sided warblers coming all the way up from Central South America just to sing songs for us. They're amazingly beautiful birds. Cross over that bridge and maybe hang out by the creek for a little bit in the morning because you'll be the only one there. But then just get up onto that hillside, and it's just this beautiful, lush, rich world. This is a great time of year to do it. So I just want to throw that out there. How did I get into that? Harvesting different times of year, spring. It's just spring up there. The leaves are just budding out. And because of that, the birds are going wild, eating all the caterpillars that are timed with the leaf out of the plants. Da-da-da-da-da. Here is another plant that goes into all sorts of ecosystems that is non-native, which is fine. I welcome a lot of non-native guests. I'm a non-native guest. But this one actually goes into native ecosystems and is quite disruptive. If you have like 10 shoots over here in this yellow square, by next year or 2 years from now, this entire room might be full with only this plant. This is Japanese knotweed. It's still sold as an ornamental. Oh, what are we doing? Usually the ornamental has pink blossoms. This one with white blossoms I found planted in front of a fancy community over near Sapphire in a fancy ritzy area that wanted some really beautiful plants, and somebody planted this, and I was like, what are you doing? But here is someone who's doing really good work in the world by harvesting the young shoots, which are a bit sour. This also is in the buckwheat family. That's the same family that rhubarb is in, and these young shoots are really nice and tender and sour and taste a bit like rhubarb stalks. Highly recommend it. They're only good for about a week. So once you start seeing those buds come up, the shoots start coming up, and usually till they're about a foot tall, they're still tender. More important, though, than the color or the thickness, because different soils are so different and different growing environments are so different, is the tender test. So just know that that's a thing that works on so many different plants. Just try snapping it down the stalk, and you'll feel where it doesn't want to snap anymore, where it just wants to bend. And that's probably where it's too fibrous. Now, I will say that in some cases, once a plant is getting more fibrous, the inside will still be smooth. So you have the choice of harvesting it and shaving off the outside with like a carrot peeler, or just with a knife is fine. Or you can just, depending on the abundance of the plant you're harvesting, you can just go and figure out where it breaks easily, and that part will be tender and good. Yeah, simple rule. Cooked. Thank you. You can eat it raw, but it'll taste a lot better cooked. Yeah, please. Yep, Japanese knotweed. By the way, this thing easily gets this tall, and the shoots are hollow. A lot of times ants will overwinter in them in the wintertime, obviously. But again, it crowds so much that it will likely be the only plant left in an area that used to be trilliums and Solomon seal, and lots of beautiful spring ephemerals will just be completely covered with this. It's kind of rough. So let's figure it out. Harvest as much rhubarb as you can. The roots, of course, some of you have probably heard, are one of our best medicine sources for Lyme's disease. They contain a substance called resveratrol. Thank you. I think resveratrol. And so maybe it's got a big message for us and can be a real helpful aid for us. But right now we're not harvesting quite enough, I think. So
There was a ton of it along the bed of the side of the river in the French River Broad.
yeah, yes, absolutely. The only thing I've seen it give it some competition, the only native plant I've seen give it competition, I should say, is river cane. And that's a plant that we almost totally extirpated from our area because it grows along the rivers, and we wanted that floodplain for growing food. And so we took out river cane, which is a bamboo relative, a native bamboo relative, Arundinaria. And now I'm seeing river cane stepping back into the scene and just being like, you think you own this riverbank? Let's go. So I'm curious how that will play out. Garlic mustard we talked about. One other thing I wanted to add is that the flower clusters are absolutely delicious when they're in bloom or just before they're in bloom. They're very much like a garlicky broccoli. Stems are my favorite part when they're young and tender. That's really a really delicious wild food is young garlic mustard stems. Please go ahead and pull the root out, because if you just cut them off, they'll actually sprout back and make flowers And I actually say, please remove them from the forest, because if not, even just if you've pulled them out and shaken the soil off them and just leave them on the ground, it's amazing. You can come back a few days later and they just put shoots out and they put flowers out and they turn into seed just laying on the ground, like in the sun. And you can like stomp on them and run them over in your car and they still produce seeds. I'm exaggerating for fun. Garlic mustard. The leaves are very high in sulfuric glycosides. They're an awesome medicine. They're really spicy, garlicky. If you like kind of the taste of powdered or dried garlic, the leaves have that flavor going on in them. I like the stems a little more mild. But these leaves, like so many of our wild leaves, especially if they're spicy, you can just lay them out in a dehydrator or on a tray in your oven at warm and just bake them until they're just crisp, till they're ready to crumble. Dehydrator, it's often about 8 hours on low setting, 100 degrees. 8 hours at 100 degrees works for a lot of leaves. It does work for garlic mustard. And then you're just going to crumble them. You can do that in your little zing zing machine again, or you can even, I've even put them in a jar recently and used the immersion blender just to see if it worked. It works fine. It's super easy to clean. And now you've got this green powder, and you can do this with so many leaves, and you can just throw that on top of your mashed potatoes or in your soup or whatever you want. You could mix that green powder with salt if you want it salty, but I usually just leave it green so I can put it in smoothies or anything I want to. Green powders are just a neat way to keep our greens with us all through the winter and through the seasons and add interesting flavors into things. Please.
These are like somewhat invasive, and you're just saying like harvest them. Would you still recommend like calling the forest and just not taking them? Does that make sense?
No. I spend a lot of my life caring for the forest in ways that are way beyond what the National Forest could ever afford to pay people to do. And I don't usually ask permission. I kind of go by the policy of I'd rather ask forgiveness than permission if I feel like I really know what I'm doing. Again, it's not that you have to call the National Forest to ask permission to harvest something. You don't have to. I just want, if you're harvesting a wild plant and you don't know what the regulations are for your area, then like that's the legalities around knowing what to harvest and not harvest. Is you may need to apply. Some rangers will tell you to apply for a day use permit, which is free, but they have you go down to the office and fill out the paperwork to say you're going to harvest a gallon of garlic mustard leaves, and then you are legally permitted to do so. Every time I've asked so far in Pisgah National Forest, they've said, don't worry, you don't need to pick up a permit, just harvest a gallon, no more than a gallon per person for personal use per day. So I'm just sharing my experience with you. Please feel free not to call every time you're going to go out and harvest garlic mustard. You could lecture them, be like, you should be paying me for this. Hey, we're into our second category. We are into trees, and I'm gonna go pretty fast, but I just want it in people's minds that there are numerous species of trees that we can tap, even in North Carolina, especially if you're at higher elevations, for their sap, for their syrup. The general rule is a tree that's at least 2 feet around at breast height. And different people have different opinions about that. Some people say one spile, or one spigot, if you will, one of these, this is called the spile right here, the piece that you hammer in that collects sap. One spile per foot of diameter. I like one spile for 2 feet of diameter. So bigger trees is what I tend to prefer. And I certainly watch people do 2-foot trees with 4 spiles on them and have no problem year after year after year after year harvesting the same trees. Question?
Are you saying 2 feet in circumference or
Diameter.
diameter?
Yep. Okay. Yeah. 2 feet in diameter. You can definitely harvest from trees that are smaller than that. And you'll find the balance. There are a lot of different species. So sugar maple is the common one you've probably heard about, people harvesting sap from and boiling it down to make maple syrup. But in our area, ashleaf maple is a really abundant tree in riparian areas, streamside and river floodplains. Black walnut is a really abundant tree that's often quite big and growing in the edges of a lot of fields and old fields. Yellow birches. You can add on sassafras. You can add on sweet birch. You can add on sycamore. We have a bunch of different trees. And the difference is often how much you're boiling down the sap. So with sugar maple or ash leaf maple, they have pretty good ratios. You can go 50 to 1 typically. So boil down 50 quarts to get 1 quart of syrup. Or 50 gallons to get 1 gallon of syrup. Or 50 pints if you want 1 pint of syrup, right? And so with a tree like yellow birch, it's more like 60 or 70 to 1. With black walnut, it's also about 70 to 80 to 1. And you'll get different flavors from all of these different trees, different flavors of syrup that come through. Was there a question? Go ahead.
When do you use this?
When the nights are still below freezing and the days are above freezing.
So in the spring.
In the winter.
Or in the winter.
Yep. The nights are still cold and the days are just getting above freezing, like 33, 34, maybe up to like 37. Those are the days. You're still wearing wool. You still got shoes on. You tried to wear a skirt the other week, but it was too cold, except for late afternoon. Doing is we're drilling a hole in a tree. Typically 3/4 of an inch hole is what's used. Most of the spiles you buy are 3/4 of an inch. You can, by the way, you can use metal spiles. You can make your own spiles. I have used sumac before. It's a really nice wood because it's a hollow wood. And I'm just going to cut the wood above a branch, a few inches above a branch, and then just below a branch. And that way I've got now a hollow chamber here. And this little part, this other branch is just to hold my bucket on. So I'm going to hang my bucket on there. But that's going to be 3/4 of an inch. And I'm going to hammer that into the hole that I already drilled into my tree. And sumac is hollow, so now you've got this little tunnel coming through. And this part here that goes into the tree, you cut that at a 45-degree angle. But again, you can just buy spiles. You can probably buy them on Amazon these days, or go to a local hardware store would be great. And you're just hammering that into the tree, usually about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. And that 45-degree angle takes over the rest. And the late winter, when all of that sunlight that the tree gathered last year is coming back up from the roots and heading out to go and give energy to the buds that are just breaking. Bud break is another time for it, before the leaves come out. A little bit of that sap is going to pour out into your bucket. And then you can drink it right like that. Tastes a little bit sweet if you have imagination, or you can just start boiling it. If you heat your home with a wood stove, you can just put it in a pot right on top of your wood stove, and it's going to steam the air, which is nice. If you heat with wood, usually your house is a little dry, so it's nice to get it steaming a little bit. It's not too much, don't worry, it's just right, I think. And then what you've got to do, whether you're heating over a fire or whether you're heating on your wood stove, is you don't want it to go too far, because if it becomes as thick as maple syrup while it's hot, when it cools down, it's going to be taffy, and you'll never get it out of the pot, or it'll be really difficult to do. So instead, you just have to keep sipping it and tasting it to make sure it doesn't go too far, which is such a chore. But some of the best moments in my life are sitting around a fire with friends, just sipping whatever sap that we're boiling and tasting it and talking about how the flavor has changed since an hour ago, and let's add in some more. Let's just keep it going. And again, if you have a wood stove, as long as someone's around to make sure it doesn't go too far, you can just keep tasting it on your wood stove, and just let it do the work for you. It's really a sweet experience. Gonna keep going because we got a lot more to cover. Basswood leaves and buds. A little wintertime snack. The buds of basswood trees are really, really delicious. You can note that they're really big and come out at a 45-degree angle. Often they're red or burgundy in color. All over the East Coast, there's a tree called American basswood, but here in the mountains we have an Appalachian basswood. It tends to be in rich cove forest communities. Any of the basswoods, there's a subspecies called Carolina basswood as well that grows more towards the Piedmont, but any of the basswoods have really delicious edible leaves as well. And I just think the idea of collecting green leaves off of trees is just an amazing, revolutionary idea. It's like a lettuce plant, but you don't have to mulch it or weed it or do anything. You just walk out to your basswood tree And basswoods coppice really easily. They have a lot of stump sprouts or sucker sprouts that come all around the base. That's one of the tree's main ways that it is competitive ecologically. It has this system so that if the main tree dies, rather than starting from just a sapling like the other trees that will be racing for that hole in the canopy, those saplings only have a little bit of roots and they don't have that much energy to race upwards. But basswood will already have 20 or 30 different little sucker sprouts at the bottom with a giant root system. So if its main trunk gets struck by lightning or hit by a huge wind gust or something, all these other little sucker sprouts are just ready with a giant root system and carbohydrate storage to race up towards the canopy. So there might be 20, 30, even 100 little stump sprouts covered with leaves. The leaves lower in the forest tend to be actually bigger and broader, and you can just harvest the greens off of those stump sprouts. Meanwhile, there's a giant tree growing above you. It's like super food forest awesomeness. So basswood also has amazing abundance of flowers. If you want to collect those flowers, they are fantastic for teas or bathtubs. You can make tea with yourself in it. Just load them into a bathtub. And they're a huge nectar crop for bees. Question?
So is it the same as linden?
It is essentially the same as linden. It's in the same genus as linden. Linden is usually a term applied to the European basswoods, but they're both in the genus Tilia. You could use either, yeah. In our area, basswood is American basswood and Appalachian basswood are what grow locally, yeah. When they're young, you can definitely eat these leaves raw. As they get a little older, steaming them or cooking them a little bit is fantastic. But they're really good raw. It's one of my favorites. They're like lightly mucilagenic. As a matter of fact, I was just chewing on basswood leaves today that were completely young and just coming out up at 6,000 feet. So depending on your elevation, these are still good to go right now. And they don't get more bitter as they get older. Like some leaves get more and more bitter or astringent. These stay mellow. They just get more fibrous towards June and July. Yep. So much to say about basswood, but delicious edible little buds in the winter and delicious leaves. Those are the ones I'm going to make my dolmas out of with my wild rice from Wisconsin, a little bit of mountain mint, pycnanthemum. Yeah, delish. Black walnuts. Da, 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 da. One of my all-time favorite wild foods. So black walnuts. So much to say. There's so many uses of this tree. Sometimes I do a whole class just on black walnut. I also do a whole class just on white pine. There's food, and there's art, and there's medicine, and there's cool ecology. There's lots with black walnut. I want to focus in and zoom in, first of all, on the nut crop because it's so amazing. Black walnut meats are my favorite nut, I think, of all time. I like them better than cashews when they're prepared correctly. I like them much, much better than European walnuts. I think the flavor is far superior, even though the nut meats are a little bit smaller. So my favorite way to prepare black walnuts, they fall in all over your yard and your car and your roof and your shed, and they're all over the place, and you walk outside and you have to be careful not to slip on them, and there's just so many. You're thinking about paying some young person down the street money to come over and harvest them all, and hope that young person is like, please, can I get paid to go harvest black walnuts? Could be a win-win scenario there. These black walnuts, okay, here's my favorite way to prepare them. I grab them, husk and all. I know the husk can be used as medicine, and you can use it to deworm your goats, and you can make incredible paints out of it, and it can be anti-parasitical, and there's so many things you might want to do with them, but I'm just going to wastefully put the entire nut and its husk on the outside into a fire that I'm sitting around with friends. And then you need about 3 to 5 minutes, so like tell a few jokes or sing a song or a story, some moment of your life that was kind of embarrassing, and connect with other people. And that's about how long it takes before it's time to pull them out. The husk is pretty much burned off, and at that point you've got a little bit of a burned husk, and you've got then the hard shell on the inside. And here's a picture of the hard shell. So there's the husk that starts yellow, green, and then turns brown. Here's the shell inside the husk. Now you've got the husk. You've pulled it out of the fire with some tongs. It's really hot. You put it onto the one flat rock you gathered, and then you take the second rock that you've gathered. These are expensive tools. Can't even buy them at Lowe's. And this one is big enough that you can grab it and smash that nut And usually it just takes one good hit, sometimes two if you're a little nervous about it or it's your first time or something like that, and that shell will break open, and you can pluck out these meats they're about that big. They're about as big as a chickpea or the meat you get out of a good-sized crawdad claw. So it's not a huge amount. But do you have a lot of black walnuts when you have black walnuts? Yeah, you tend to have a lot. But it's the flavor. You taste these black walnuts, especially baked right from the fire, and they're absolutely delicious. There's some neat write-ups about black walnut oil, by the way, that have been showing that it is helpful for mild depression. So that's really nice. People are prescribing it for seasonal affective disorder as well. I thought that was cool. I was like, yeah, I feel good when I eat them. I feel great when I eat them, actually. Another reason besides the amazing flavor that this is one of my absolute favorite wild foods is that black walnut stays good, as in not rancid, in the shell for usually at least 2 years or more. I had some that I had waited 2.5 years, and I remember talking to Doug Elliott, being like, "Oh, Doug, I've let these go so long, I don't know if they're good." And he said, "Oh, try them, they're probably still good." And I was like, "Really?" And I smashed open those walnuts, and they were still good. They weren't rancid. They weren't eaten by maggots. I wasn't picking ones out that were going bad. There weren't cheesy ones. If you've harvested a lot of other wild nuts, you'll know that like maggots and mold and like so many things can get into acorns and can get into hazelnuts and can get into chestnuts, etc. These black walnuts just keep really well, which is a cool thing. Basically, it's like you against the squirrels. Like that's the big thing is you have to protect them from squirrels. If you can do that with a dog is nice, or a gun works, or like whatever your thing is, then you're going to have good black walnuts for a long time. Really handy, especially for those of us that either don't have refrigeration or have very limited refrigeration. Yeah. The Nutty Buddy Collective. It's in my notes. How did you know that? No, it's great. Do you want to tell us a little bit? Just to say, we have a local club. It used to be called the Asheville Fruit and Nut Club, but they've kind of evolved into a different thing. They're connected, yeah. I think they were already stewing up plans for this, but I know I had a conversation with both Tom and Bill at one point and was just like, you know what we really need to do is just pitch in together and get a nut oil press, and like if enough of us go in on it, you know, we could come up with the $4,000 to do it, and like we could get something within like 6 months or so that they had done that. I think they were going to do it anyway, but I like to feel like maybe I was a contributor to it. And they went big. They went for the $8,000 one, I think. But now they have this press that can actually squeeze the oil out of a lot of our different local nuts, including red oak acorns, which make a really, really tasty oil, including bitternut hickories, which I might talk about next, including black walnuts. They make amazing oil, so I highly recommend the Nutty Buddy Collective buying oil from them. You can also bring them your nuts. You can bring them hickory nuts or black walnuts or acorns, and they will process them and give you a portion back. Really, really cool. I think they would pay you for them as well, but the amount of money you're going to get, I would just say, give me oil. How much oil is this worth? And wheel your trash can full of black walnuts to them and see what they'll give you back for it, because these oils are absolutely amazing. Love this native tree. It's amazing, and it's adapted for full sun, early succession areas. Don't park your car under it, right? That's just silly, or at least during the fall. Yeah, but there's so much to black walnuts that we're not even going into. I know that folks have heard that there's a lot of things you can't grow under them. I'll just mention right now, because we're going to go in a whole chapter on berries maybe, is that most of our cane fruits do well under them. So wine berries, blackberries, raspberries, they all do great under black walnuts. Pawpaws also do good under black walnut. That's an awesome native fruit. So there are a lot of things that do really well under black walnuts. Sochand is good under black walnuts. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go really fast. Hickories. Again, a tree that I would love to talk to you about for hours and hours and hours. There's so many uses of the wood and the fiber and the leaves. Oh, this is another tree that you can tap. You can tap most of our hickories for their sap and boil it down and get syrup out of it. In this case, I want to talk about the nuts And hickory nuts, unlike walnut, where if you smash them open, the pieces of meat are big enough that you can pick out and get some good meal out of. Hickory nuts, the cavities inside the shell are so small, the meats are really tiny. It would take a lot of work. It'd be worth it if you were a mouse or a flying squirrel, but if you're a human, probably not. Instead, what we tend to do is smash up these shells. The husks tend to be fairly easy to break off. Matter of fact, the thicker husked hickories are the ones you want for making hickory milk. Peel off those husks, or they're often just off, smash the shells, and then put them in a pot and just boil them for an hour. You can do 2 or 3 hours, you can do 5 hours. It's just amount of how much flavor you want to get out of them. And the fat that's in there kind of comes into the water, and it makes like a really nice broth. And I love it. We call it hickory nut milk. And I really love to drink hickory nut milk. Some people sweeten it with a little bit of honey or maple syrup, or you could use hickory syrup, right? That would be the way to go. And I tend to like mine savory, so I add a little miso to mine and maybe a little bit of nutritional yeast or some hippie thing like that. And I really like it as like a soup, but it goes either way just fine. My understanding, by the way, of the word hickory is it's a Haudenosaunee word. Some folks call those folks the Iroquois, but I think they call themselves the Haudenosaunee, and that they would make a hickory milk, and then in wintertime, in really cold wintertime, freeze that hickory broth, and then that would separate out the fat from the water, as opposed to skimming, which I've done before, and it just takes forever, and you get like 2 tablespoons. But if you take it outside on a nice upstate New York night when it's -7 outside, and it freezes quite quickly, and then the fat all separates out from the water. And my understanding is the Haudenosaunee folks would take that fat and scrape off that fat, and then actually ferment it a little bit. And their word for that was something like the word we use, hickory, for the tree. So I don't know actually how it was pronounced, but that's kind of a fun thing of the origin of the word hickory. So yeah, smashing the nuts, again, not the husk, but the shell and the meats, and boiling it, and it's that liquid that you're going to pour off. If you pour it off carefully, by the way, most of the meats that have separated off land on top of the shells that are at the very bottom, and you can get a number of tablespoons, depending on how much you do, or even cups of meat, until at some point you start getting little bits of the shell, and then you want to be careful because they can really do a job on your teeth.
You have to add water to that,
So yeah, ratios, great question. I usually take about 1 part crushed up hickory nuts to about 2 parts water. You could go a lot less or a lot more depending on your desired outcome of like how soupy, brothy do you want it versus how like thin, milky do you want it. But there's 1 parts crushed up hickory nuts to 2 parts water, I think, is a great place to start. Boil for an hour. Yep. And sometimes I'll keep the same pot boiling for like 4 days. So, and just like keep boiling it every day. Not overnight, but in the morning I'll boil it again and maybe add more shells in, or maybe not, depending on how flavorful it is. Because hickory nuts are really abundant often in our area. So, by the way, the bitter nut hickory, one of the varieties you've probably heard people say, don't try to eat that one. It's true. The bitter nut hickory, which has a very thin shell and very small buds on the twigs, no buds actually at all on the twigs. It has naked buds on the ends of its twigs. The bitter nut hickory is not one for this. It'll come out bitter, which might be nice, but pretty bitter. However, the bitter nut hickory is the prime nut for squeezing the oil out of. The oil isn't bitter. That stays with the carbohydrate in the nut, and it is the largest and most fatty nut of all of our hickories. That's one thing the Nutty Buddy Collective is really helping to educate people about and collect. Da-da-da-da-da. Nice. Our wild persimmons, Diospyros virginiana, Diospyros meaning the pear of the gods, are so good and so delicious. And my first introduction to it was one of the earliest wild foods I ever had, because I was going down to go fishing for rainbow trout with my uncle, and we were walking down towards the lake, and we passed this little persimmon tree that had all of these bright yellow persimmons on it. And yeah, right. You know where this is going. And he grabbed a couple, and he handed me one, and with a straight face, he just bit into it and smiled and watched me bite into it. And an unripe persimmon, which is very unripe when it's still yellow green, is so astringent that my face probably froze in that position for like an hour. I puckered so much. Really good trick. I highly recommend doing that to a kid near you. We've got to keep kids on their toes. When wild persimmons are actually ripe, if you have one that's bright orange, like a light color orange, it's probably not ripe. It wants to be like orange red, and it ought to be basically like jelly. Like it can barely hold itself together. If it falls on the ground, it's probably going to splat a little bit, and the skin's going to break open. You're going to be like, usually in the store, if the skin is broken on a fruit, it means it's bad. I'm going to skip that one. But that's the one you want from the ground. That's the one that the possums are going to go for all night long if you don't go for them. And yeah, so if you pick them too early, or if you try to get one that's still firm and it's not jelly-like, it's going to be astringent in your mouth. And you're going to be like, why do people eat these? But persimmons are an amazing wild local fruit. And usually, if you get a tree that has mostly female flowers on it, often they're split male and female, although sometimes they'll mix a little bit and have male and female on the same tree. But typically, you have a male flower tree or a female flower tree, and if you have both in your vicinity, they tend to fruit heavy. Right? This tree wants full sun. It's an Eboniaceae plant. The heartwood of it is really dark and beautiful. It's a type of ebony, actually. But they want full sun. They're early succession. And if you have a persimmon tree in mostly full sun, you'll get a really heavy fruit load. And these are just amazing native fruits. One of my favorite things to do with them is I actually just take the fruits and I smash them down and I dry them on a tray in a big flat sheet in the sun, and I just make persimmon fruit leather out of them. I used to spend a lot of time putting them through a squeeze-o-matic to get the shells out, and then one of my friends was just like, oh, I just leave the seeds in, and either you can crunch the seeds and eat them, or you can just spit them out like watermelon seeds. And since I've been doing that, I'm like 10 times more likely to actually make the fruit leather. Because the process of squeeze-o-matic was like big and messy, and it was fun, and it's, but it's like a thing. The easier the better is kind of how I roll with wild food. So.
They'll ripen real good off the tree too. If you find them on the ground and they're not quite ripe, you just hold on to them.
Thank you for that. Absolutely. Yeah. And ours are smaller than the cultivated varieties or the Asian varieties that are a lot bigger, but ours are sweeter. They're so good. If you haven't put persimmons in your yard yet as part of your food forest or your own home, I highly recommend it. One other piece is you've got Victoria there is holding a little bit of one of the meristematic growth tips. The young growth is a really nice tea. It's really flavorful. There's no caffeine in it, but it's a delicious green tea-like flavor. Highly recommend it. Easy to harvest on young branches. Mulberries. I'm tempted just to skip over it, but I'll just say this. Eat the berries. Red mulberry and white mulberry are two varieties. They're so delicious. And tea the leaves. These leaves are really awesome, high in antioxidants, taste really wonderful. Young leaves are my favorite, but I've used old leaves and they are still good. You could probably eat the leaves just fine, but teaing the leaves is my favorite way. And I didn't actually learn that until I was in Laos, and I went and stayed on a mulberry farm. And I was just ecstatic because I love to eat mulberries, and they had very little focus on the berries. They were all about the leaves. That was their main crop that they sold all over Asia, all through China and to Japan in huge quantities because the leaves were so popular as a high antioxidant tea. Fun, huh? And they were like, berries? Yeah, sure, you can do that. Like, fine, whatever. They did harvest a lot of the berries and dried them, and the berries dry really well, and dried mulberries are a total treat. So there's a lot you can do with mulberries. The red mulberries are native species, and it does grow well down here in the southern Appalachians. The white mulberries, there's many cultivars you can buy, and I recommend both of them. They're wonderful. Da-da-da-da-da. This would be the time when I would cue Margot, and she would give us a spiel on what we can do to get involved with preserving and saving our eastern hemlocks. Margaret, what's the name of your organization? How can people get involved and find out more information?
And you can check out the Hemlock Restoration
Hemlock Restoration Initiative. Most years I do a hike for them, and Margot and I head up to visit some of the Carolina hemlocks, one of our really kind of world rare species of hemlock that grows here in our region, has the most abundance of it of anywhere in the world, and the eastern hemlocks as well. It's just my favorite tree in the world. I love eastern hemlocks very much, and they are in dire straits right now with the hemlock woolly adelgid, which was introduced by humans, and there's a whole story there. I will say that that the young green tips of hemlocks are one of my favorite spices and little like green foods in the world. I rarely pick them anymore because a lot of times if you're seeing really healthy hemlock tips, a lot of times they've been treated. So with some sort of pesticide to preserve that hemlock. Sometimes you'll find a tree way deep in the forest these days that still is healthy and growing these young green tips, and go ahead and have a nibble. I put this in here though because the hemlock is my favorite tree. We've got 7 minutes and I'll zoom through some mushrooms. This was a great year for morels. I find that the trick with morels is we need rain just in the right time of early spring. And we don't always get that in the mountains. Sometimes we get a week or two of dry, and all my friends in South Carolina are bringing home buckets of morels, and we've got not much to find. This year was really good. This is actually pictures from last year, but this year I harvested many dozens of morels and was really happy. Everybody's got their tricks. My trick is big old tulips. If you can find big old tulip trees, look around on the ground around big old tulip trees right about the time that red buds are blooming. Yeah, do you know red buds, the bright pink little trees in the pea family? Also delicious wild flowers. Yeah. Tulip poplar, thank you. Yeah, Liriodendron tulipifera. I also look for them in places where you'll see showy orchis, a little Orchis spectabilis, a little purple and white blossom in the orchid family. Usually when I'm picking morels, I'm often seeing showy orchids around, so that's another possible trick. But you know how mushrooms are. A lot of times they defy all the tricks. One thing I want to say about morels is I really encourage folks to, if you need to wash them, but then dry them out not totally, but dry them out really well before you cook them again. Don't cook your morels moist. I often put them in the dashboard of my car in a sunny spot in the window to let them get dry before I cook them. When I cook them, I actually start them in the pan with no fat, and I let them sear a little bit, and then I add my fat to it, which I actually usually add coconut oil and butter because that's how I roll. Yeah, because you want to brown them almost like you're cooking onions to get really sweet, nutty flavor out. Some people put them in soups. I think then they taste like soggy mushrooms, but up to you. Yeah, I'm just going to do a few more slides because we're almost at time. And there's just no way we could possibly cover all of the wild foods in our region, but here's a good sampling. Which one of these is not a chanterelle? Which one of these would have you both throwing up and sitting on the toilet at the same time? Which one of these do you want to be careful? We have 8 species of chanterelles, and it turns out that this one right here is a jack-o'-lantern, a cluster of jack-o'-lanterns, which do indeed glow in the dark from their gills on a very, very dark night. They are not edible. Well, anything's edible once. They are not recommended for eating. Luckily for most people, jack-o'-lanterns would not be killers. They're not killer mushrooms. They're just pukers or double barrelers, if you will. Good to know. They have really thin gills that look like pages of a book underneath them, whereas our species of chanterelle have these thick ridges underneath. Every single spring I get calls from people that are like, Luke, I think I did something wrong, and I have to talk them through it and make sure that they know that they're not going to die. They're just going to be throwing up. At least 2 times in the last 4 years, couples have called me saying that they ate jack-o'-lanterns by accident, or they suspected they did, and they showed me the picture. Where'd you harvest from? And horrible pictures. Take pictures of mushrooms before you eat them, especially if they're on your growing edge, right? So that you can show someone what you ate if something goes a little bit astray. But in both of these cases, the females of the couples did not get sick, and the males did. Now they asked me after that, does that mean I could keep eating jack-o'-lanterns? I was like, I don't know, I wouldn't risk it. But just to say, a lot of varieties in wild mushrooms. That's one of the reasons why it can be confusing whether or not a mushroom is poisonous or not. because some people don't react to proteins that other people react to, right? Just like, are peanuts a poisonous food? Yeah, they're deadly poisonous for some people. They're not for other people. The proteins in mushrooms can be very much the same way. A lot of people they can agree with easily, and a lot of people they might not agree with. If you're trying a wild mushroom for the first time, go small in the beginning and see how your body reacts to it. Once you know that your body feels good with it, then you can increase your quantity. And yeah, there's a lot to harvesting mushrooms. Chanterelles are perennial. If you find a chanterelle patch, you're going to find it year after year after year. They are so delicious and nutty and apricot-y, and we have a lot of different varieties. This kind actually down here, these really bright red ones, this is the cinnabar chanterelle. They're actually a little bit less flavorful than some of the other varieties, but they're really pretty on your pasta dish. Oh my goodness. This is our common chanterelle, and down here is a smooth chanterelle. Both of those have really nice kind of apricot-y tones in them, and I almost feel like they taste like cashews and apricots together. Yeah, I love chanterelles. And the chanterelle season is like really soon. It's usually late May, early June. Sometimes it's late June, depending on your elevation. So chanterelle season is coming up. Often, even your friends who are way into mushrooms, even if they're share chanterelles with you, they usually won't share their chanterelle spot because it's a spot they can go to year after year after year. But you can find your own. Oh my goodness, I harvested my first chicken of the woods of the year today on a giant old red oak that had been struck by lightning and cracked in half, and it was still soft and yellow. There was barely any that had the orange on top yet, but it was all yellow like the underneath is. The underside is porous like a sponge. It doesn't have gills. Chicken of the woods is an amazing wild edible, and very often you can find it in loads of like 50 pounds or even 100 pounds. One thing I do with many, many mushrooms, by the way, is sometimes they're in such great abundance that what I'll be doing is taking them home and just processing them for hours in a given evening and cooking them all up and then putting them in jars and freezing them. Some mushrooms you could dehydrate and rehydrate, but I find more success if I have access to a freezer. So that's kind of an important tool. It's one of my favorite tools in the modern age. Windows and freezers, way up there for me. Yeah, cook them and however you like to cook them and freeze them. Most mushrooms do really well that way, whereas the dehydrating and rehydrating is iffy. Matter of fact, chicken of the woods does not dehydrate and rehydrate well at all. I wouldn't recommend it at all. But it does cook and freeze, and then you can thaw it, and it's ready to go. Such a nice way to have a lot of protein from the woods. We're at time, but I just want to say one more thing on mushrooms, which is that I've been on a lot of survival trips and wild foods trips and survival trips where I'd be in the woods for a week and with really skilled people, and we had all had training on different types of hunting and all sorts of wild foods together, and often mushrooms were the main calorie intake we would have. On day 3 of eating greens, if you don't have a good fat source or salt, you're just like, oh, nettles again, yay, you know. And you go out to try to hunt, and hunting can be really hard. Maybe you'll get a few frogs, or if you're lucky, a turtle or something like that. But hunting like squirrels and rabbits is like really tough. It happens sometimes with the right prayers and all that. But mushrooms, if you know your mushrooms well, most seasons of the year, other than the dead of winter, even then sometimes, you can collect a lot of protein and a lot of fat that's easy to cook and easy to digest. As soon as I expanded my palette of mushrooms, the amount of pounds of wild foods I've taken in has just like quadrupled easily, maybe a lot more than that. So getting into your wild mushrooms, it can be a really fun adventure. And I've always thought I didn't like mushrooms until I started trying the variety of wild mushrooms that are out there. So many different textures and flavors. So even if you feel like I don't like button mushrooms or whatever they are, try some of the different wild mushrooms, and there might be something there for you. I think it's time, and so I should go ahead and wrap. Why don't I just see? Can we do 3 minutes of questions, or do we?
I'm absolutely okay with that. Everybody, how about if you would like to leave and not be part of questions, you can do that quietly. And if you do want to be here for questions, let's take 5 minutes.
And I'll just say, too, again, my name is Luke Cannon, and my organization is called Astounding Earth. And I teach lots of one-day workshops and do plant walks for people. You can hire me to come out to your yard or even your favorite area of national forest, and I can do plant walks or bird walks or all sorts of nature walks. I also have ongoing series classes, particularly in the spring and the fall, where you can come out for 10 Thursdays and do birds, or 8 Wednesdays and do wild foods and that kind of stuff. So feel free to look up my website, Astounding Earth, and you can get on the mailing list. I send out about 5 emails a year, so I won't overwhelm your inbox. And we have a lot of fun in the woods. Questions, comments, thoughts? Please, Laura.
Small book that I can carry in the woods that is like wild food you can eat for dummies.
I don't believe in the dummies thing.
Well, for
my
newbies.
highest recommendation for wild foods books are 3 books by Samuel Thayer, all of which are fantastic. They're full of photographs. They're full of how-to information for newbies. And he only speaks from his personal experience, and he gives hints. He's also really fun. Like, his books are really interesting to read and silly, and he puts jokes in them, and he tells you about all of his mishaps. And like Samuel Thayer, any of his 3 books on wild food are totally terrific. He even has a DVD. And if you get a chance to walk with Sam, he's hilarious. He's absolutely brilliant. Yeah. Thank you. Other questions? Sam Thayer. Yeah, he probably goes by Sam Thayer, not Samuel. I just call him Samuel. Fun.
I was going to say something.
Yeah. Other questions, comments?
If you're new-ish to harvesting mushrooms, big choices, kind of, not big choices, but what are the top 3 that you want to be really cautious of and mindful about not?
So let's see. When I teach mushrooms to folks, I usually go over 12 families, and the first 2 I start with are how to identify 2 families that have a lot of poisonous members. And those are the Amanita family, which also has edibles in it, but has stuff that will kill you, and the Cortinarius family and some of its relatives, which again, there's a few edibles in there, but there's members of that family that will kill you. So I try to introduce people by family concept of how to know that group is one I'm just going to wait for a long time. If you're going out, I really recommend harvesting mushrooms for a while with someone who knows their stuff. Really, I'm not just saying that because I want you to come take classes. It's just a smart thing. I don't really recommend learning just by book, definitely not by internet. Beep, 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 beep. If you're gonna go by book, like here's what I did. I got 6 books, and I wouldn't eat something until 6 books all agreed, and I like thoroughly read through and was like, I am, I risk my life positive that I identified this correctly. And it takes a while, but really, taking a mushroom class with me or at the Highlands Biological Station, they offer great mushroom classes every year, Highlands Biological Station, to get to know the different groups before you get into the field guides will really pay off, really pay off. And there's a number of other wild food groups too, besides me. No Taste Like Home does tours regularly. They'll do some introduction to mushroom identification as well. Mark Williams does a lot of wild foods, and he does mushroom ID as well. There's a lot of folks in Asheville where you could learn some mushrooms. Yeah.
I share something about mushrooms.
Please.
When I first started feeling confident in my mushroom ID for a lot of edibles, I ate a little bit, but I ate a little bit of a lot of different kinds. And on day 6, I started feeling unhappy in my belly. I can eat all of those mushrooms just fine, but just don't eat them day after day after day, maybe, even if they're different species, like typically would all be okay once in a while.
Matter of fact, what I really recommend folks is if you eat a wild mushroom, only try 1 new one per day. Because if you try 3 in a day, or even just 2 in the same day that you've never tried before, and then you feel funky afterwards, you don't know. And then it's like, now I feel suspicious about both of those mushrooms. So just try 1, and then wait a few days before you try another variety. Luckily, a lot of the big mushroom harvests are kind of seasonal, and I can tell you what time of year I'm harvesting what mushrooms in quantity, and then there's often a little gap before you harvest the next thing. So there's hundreds of really good edible species out there, but only about a dozen that you can harvest in quantity predictably. So, yeah. Thank you all so much. Please come out and walk in the woods with me sometime. And, yeah.